about beaming and how that affects the structure of the way music is written and the way music is read. Essentially, when you look at beaming, you're going to be thinking about grouping notes according to the beat structure, and where the note falls within that. Why do we beam music a certain way? Why can't we beam it however we feel like beaming it? Well, essentially, because it's a lot easier to read something like this than it is to read something like this. When you look at the first example, you can clearly see that this is all part of one beat, and that this is part of one beat, and that this is part of one beat, meaning that this, and this will all be numbers. But when we look at something like this, it's very difficult to determine where the downbeats are in all of this mess. And if we don't know where the downbeats are easily, it's going to be difficult to perform the music correctly. The meter is what determines the beat structure. So when you think about simple meters, like 3/4, the beat is divided by two equal parts. But when you think of compound meters, meters like 6/8, the beat is divided into 3 equal parts. This means that in 3/4, you'll commonly see figures like this, 2/8 notes together. But in 6/8, that would be much less common than this, where we would see 3/8 notes joined together. This is 2 equal parts to a beat, and this is 3 equal parts to a beat. If you look at simple meters, there are common groupings that recur. 2/8 notes, a dotted eighth 16th, an eighth 2/16, 4/16. These aren't the only examples, but these are 4 different examples of how one beat, in this case 1/4 note beat, could be divided up into different values, but still all beamed together to represent that those values share one beat. In compound meters, we see things like 3/8 notes, a dotted 8 16/8, 8 2/16 and an eighth, or even 2/16 and 2/8, and many other varieties of rhythmic values. What do all of these have in common? In this case, they're all sharing 3/8 notes as the total value of that beat. Even though it's written different ways, all 3 add up to make 3/8 notes, or one dotted quarter note. When you look at certain rhythmic values, they'll be beamed differently depending on the meter they're in. In simple triple, we have 3 beats with 2 parts. Simple means the beats have 2 parts, and triple means there are 3 of them in a given measure. So triple structure says that's a beat, and that's a beat, 3 beats. Simple means that it has 2 equal parts, in this case an eighth note and an eighth note within each of these beats. We can see clearly that if we divided the beats up, they would all be beamed within their beat and not across the beat lines. But that same rhythmic value set in compound duple looks very different. Instead of 3 groups of 2/8 notes, we now have 2 groups of 3/8 notes, with our beat division happening here instead of here and here. So again, the same rhythmic value could be written in different ways depending on the meter that it's in. Simple triple will have 2 parts to each beat, but have 3 beats. Compound duple will have 3 parts to each beat, but only 2 beats. This is the core idea of how beaming works in different meters. Let's look at some more examples. In simple triple, again, we have 3 beats with 2 parts, which means that quarter, eighth, eighth, quarter, in 3/4 looks like this, where there's a clear divide between beats 1 and 2 here, and between beats 2 and 3 here. But if I were to take that same idea and put it into 6/8, I couldn't beam it the same way. Well, why not? Because in 6/8, this is a beat line. This separates the first beat of the measure from the second beat of the measure. In 3/4, I could easily beam these across because they were part of the same beat, but in 6/8, they are no longer part of the same beat, which means that I can't beam them together anymore. By separating them, I show that this is a split between beats. By connecting them, I show that they now share a beat. It's very different in the way the music is performed and perceived. Another example. In 3/4, 3/4 notes is very, very common. Again, it splits the notes based on where the beats are. But in 6/8, I couldn't have that same rhythmic value. Why not? Because that middle quarter note sits right at the point between beats. Half of the quarter note is in one beat, and the other half of the quarter note is in the other. Well, what does that mean? It means I can't do that. I can't write that. Now, does it mean that that rhythmic idea is impossible in 6/8? Not at all. We can still have that idea, but we can't write it that way. We have to write it this way instead. In this case, I've shown an eighth note in the first beat and an eighth note in the second beat, but I have tied them together to show that they represent a value equal to a quarter note, even though they're not sharing the same beat and can't be put together as a quarter note normally would. So to summarize, the purpose of beaming and of notating things within a beat structure makes music much easier to read, much easier to perform. Music will sound like the meter it's written in for the purpose of that meter, for the purpose of greater musical expression. You have to know your meter types, and you have to know what that meter type means for the beat structure. How many beats are in each measure, and how many parts does each beat have? Then you beam according to that beat. That means that adjacent flagged notes, eighth notes and sixteenths, within the same beat will be beamed together. It also means that notes that are beamed and tied within the same beat would just become a larger note. If they're part of a separate beat, they would be split into smaller notes. Don't beam across beats. Keep things together within a single beat. A note shouldn't cross a beat line unless it's longer than a beat. For example, half notes are usually longer than the beat that they're in. So they'll cross a beat line. But quarter notes and eighth notes are rarely longer than a beat. So they will more often be split up into different values. The exception to this is in music that's highly syncopated, meaning music that spends a lot of time focusing on things that are not the downbeats. That music might use a different beat structure, and it might beam things and notate things a little differently to represent that beat structure. But in most cases, we're going to try to keep things within the beat. I hope that made sense. Continue to study, and I bet you'll get this in no time.